these Torah-observant opponents of Paul is that they thought that he was actually bringing these people into conflict with Rome, and therefore endangering them. Let me explain what I mean by this second point here. I don't think that he preached an incomplete gospel, but here's what he did do, okay? As I said, the default position, many gods, right? Most people thought that there was a God of virtually anything. Paul preached one God, whose son Jesus had been crucified, died, was buried, and then was raised from the dead. Okay? That was Paul's preaching. For Paul, the boundary-setting practice that gives someone exclusive access to God is baptism. Now, interestingly, that's the church's theology, right? That if you get baptized, you enter into this relationship with God, which is a privilege. You know, it's just as simple as that. You're now a child of God, therefore you have a privileged relationship with God. And baptism is the boundary-setting practice that makes all that possible. Now, what's interesting from our point of view, the Torah-observant Christians also were baptized. So Paul really has, we'll take a look at a couple of passages here in a second, but Paul really has logic in his side. He basically says, you know, if you don't think baptism is important, why are you having yourself baptized? And if you are having yourself baptized, why are you doing these other things? For him, the only essential ritual was baptism. Now, but this other thing, the dangers that Christians faced, I think is really quite intriguing. Okay, Christianity, you know, like Judaism, in fact, this is the gift that children of Abraham gave us, is this notion that there is only one God. And it's a strict monotheism. Remember the first commandment. Have no other gods before me. Right? But under Roman law, Judaism is what's called religio licita. Or for those of you who know ecclesiastical Latin, religio licita, which sounds really weird to me. The Latin that I learned was classical Latin, or really better, Germanic Latin, because that's where I grew up. And we would pronounce it religio licita, but it means what you think it means, licit religion. And here was the deal, okay? Rome had all these public rituals that people were expected to participate in. Now, from one point of view, they were probably no more than political rallies. But from another point of view, they were quasi-religious because typically you burned incense in honor of one or the other of the gods, right? So a thing that today we would say, well, it's just a political rally and we're going to acclaim the emperor and isn't that great, would have looked too much like the worship of another god. Jews couldn't do it because, you know, Yahweh is a jealous God and all that kind of business. But here's where ethnicity and religious commitments can sometimes work to your advantage. It was one of the Herods, Herod the Great, as a matter of fact, who basically says to the Caesars, look, I'm king over these people whose God insists that they cannot pay tribute to any other god. It's weird, I know, but it's how they operate. Ergo, while we cannot pray to the gods on your behalf, we can pray for you to our God. And by the way, you'll have to pay for those sacrifices in the temple and all of that, but Rome was perfectly willing to accommodate Judaism in that respect. As long as they prayed for the emperor and the empire, then it was okay. So it has this kind of legal status. Now, as long as, if you're a Christian, and you consider yourself just another denomination of Judaism, you know, like Pharisees or Sadducees, you fall under this legal dispensation. But, remember, how did people know who was Christian and who was Jewish and who was not? Works of the law. Okay? The works of the law. But if you're not practicing the works of the law, it looks like you basically are refusing to engage in these rituals that Rome thinks are very, very important. But again, even if you're not practicing the works of the law, but you are convinced of the truth of the gospel, you still can't participate in these rituals, right? So the refusal to participate in the ritual would bring you into trouble. And that's why in the letter to the Galatians, it's chapter 6, and we're going to see, he's not at his most charitable here, okay? He's kind of he gets pretty mean in some of this. But he says here, this is in chapter 6, verse 12, it is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would compel you to be circumcised, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Okay? And that seems to be the evidence at our disposal that suggests that this getting these folks circumcised would then prevent their being persecuted. That makes sense to everybody? Okay? Now, and I'm trying to sort of see their point of view. Ultimately, of course, Paul's point of view swayed. We don't believe in the works of the law. We don't insist that, you observe certain dietary restrictions and so forth and so on. But what about the dangers that Paul faced? And that's why I asked you to read 2 Corinthians chapters 10, 11, and 12. He got lots of grief, okay? And he got lots of grief from those two places that we mentioned at the very beginning, namely the synagogue and Roman officials. But if you turn to chapter 11, he's talking about his rivals here, right, his opponents. This is in chapter 11, verse 21b. Whatever anyone dares to boast of, speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. And here's the point. 5 times I've received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. We'll just stop there for a second. Okay? It was thought that 40 lashes would kill you. So the punishment exacted by synagogue officials, if you were deemed to be troublesome, was to lash you 39 times. So the idea was to bring you to the very point of death. Now this was not just, a smack. They took something that was like a cat o' nine tails, long leather straps. There were rocks and shells and all that, lead pellets woven into those things. When they would strike you on the back, it would split your skin, and ultimately it would begin to separate some of the flesh really from the bones. Okay? Yeah. I mean, once would be horrible. Your back would be ribbons of scars. And it happened to him 5 separate times. Now again, remember this is an age before Neosporin, right? Okay? So, the only really antiseptic they would have had would have been wine they poured on it. Imagine how that would have stung. And then they probably would have tried to soften the scars with oil, which might have brought on more infection. I mean, who knows? But his back would have been a mess, okay? And the scars that were left were also meant to shame the individual. Scars that you got on your front indicated you were brave, or at least strong, right? Because you would have gotten those scars in battle or in a fight or something. But scars on your back meant you were either running away, or you'd been beaten because you had disobeyed somebody. Now, he goes on though, because not only does he have these 40 lashes less one 5 times over, but 3 times he says, I've been beaten with rods. That is bastinado. And what that involved was the Romans would put these guys, troublemakers, in stocks, basically. Put their feet, immobilize them, take something about the size of a baseball bat, and then beat their feet. Okay? Now, we've all stubbed our toes on the corner of the bed, in the middle of the night, right? Okay? Sometimes because of, how does one put this? A certain overfamiliarity with either mash and hops, or an equal overfamiliarity with distilled spirits, or perhaps with wine. Okay? But you're a little clumsy, you're a little drunk, you stub your toe, and what's your reaction? Usually words of Anglo-Saxon derivation. Now, that said, again, this is an age before, X-rays and all that. All those bones in the feet would have been broken. The best he would have been able to do is to bind his feet up with rags and hope that the bones knit together. But his feet would have hurt him for the rest of his life. Okay? And that happened to him 3 times. Then he ends up saying, so they beat his feet 3 different times. I mean, says, once I was stoned. Now we're not really sure who stoned him, except the Acts of the Apostles talks about it. It was probably a mob action, the way that the Acts of the Apostles describes it. But stoning somebody was really meant to kill him, and then bury him beneath the pile of stones that had been the cause of their death. And he survived that. So if nothing else, Paul of Tarsus is a very tough guy. You know, he would have played rugby, perhaps. Okay? A really tough guy. But he could have survived all that business. Then he says, he has these sort of narrow escapes. He says, if I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, the one who is blessed forever, knows that I do not lie. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window on the wall and escaped his hands. Now, it's tempting, of course, to see that as a kind of an Indiana Jones sort of moment, where he kind of gets away. Here's a 14th century enamel that depicts Paul being let down over the wall. There's the basket, there's Paul, there's the guys in the, helping him over the wall. It all looks, even here, kind of quasi-heroic. Note that he says, I will boast about shameful things. Do you know what was carried out typically in those baskets? Well, garbage and something a little even more disgusting than that. Okay? Excrement. Absolutely, because this is an age before plumbing. So you had something called a chamber pot in which you made deposits. At some point, those deposits would be placed in a basket. The basket would be lowered over the wall. And these walled cities have moats, right? It wasn't just a pretty little stream, okay? It was sewage down there. So Paul the polite way is he's taken out with the trash, but he's basically landing in sewage. This is anything but heroic here, okay? And he's doing that to escape this regional authority, the governor under King Aretas, okay? Now, all of this, remember, we're talking about Paul and his opponents. How did he respond, okay? Not always in the most praiseworthy manner. Sometimes he responds with invective. So, for instance, in chapter 5 of the letter to the Galatians, he is, there he's talking about all these folks that want to impose circumcision on his people. And he says in chapter 5, verse 12, I wish those who unsettle you would cut the whole thing off. Effectively castrate themselves. Okay? This is not really nice. Okay? Similarly, in the letter to the Philippians, he's kind of dealing with the same issue. In chapter 3, again, because these folks are following him all around, basically sort of, I think, probably saying, well, he began well, but there's a few things you all need to know, and here are some of the things you need to know. So he says, look out for the dogs. Look out for the evil workers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. For we are the true circumcision, we who worship God in spirit and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. Now, calling Torah-observant Christians dogs is a particularly awful insult. You all may remember that story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, right? Jesus leaves the land, he goes into the region of Tyre, and he finds this gal whose daughter is sick, and the woman is understandably frantic. And we don't know how old the woman was, we don't know how old the daughter was, but we can imagine you're a mom and your little girl is sick, you're going to be really frantic. And she comes to Jesus and she says, my daughter is very ill, and will you please heal her? And you remember what Jesus' reply is? It is not right to take something from the children and give it to dogs. Okay? Dogs were typically, was an epithet that Jews used to describe non-Jews. Now, I know a lot of us think dogs are really cute. That's because we're used to beagles and cocker spaniels and, whatever else are out there. The dog in Jesus' day was basically a scavenger. Little better than a coyote or a jackal or something like that. You hate squirrels? Oh. You have to deal with your issues somewhere else. I know people have all these phobias, but now's not the time to deal with them. Just kidding. I'm giving you a hard time. But you're bitter, and I can understand. Okay, it's not. But now it's not the time. But the issue, when calling somebody a dog, is basically saying, you're disgusting. Really, that's what they're saying. Now, she outwits it just to tell that story. Because she says, all right, master, sure. But people still throw scraps to the dogs. So she says, effectively, throw me a bone here. And Jesus is kind of amused by that. And he says, for that answer, you'll get what you want, go home, your daughter's well, and he heals the little girl at a distance. And I think one of the things that makes the story so wonderful is that Jesus is entertained by her display of wit and ultimately gives her what she wants. But I recount that story for you because dog is a term that Torah-observant Christians, or Torah-observant people, Jew or Christian alike, would use for non-Jews. And note what Paul does. He calls these Torah-observant Christians dogs. So he takes the insult and hurls it back at them. Now, I'm not advising that you try this at home, by the way, okay? He says, many, as I've often told you, this is over in verse 18 and 19, I've told you, and now tell you with tears, live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is the belly. They glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. I mean, to say that they glory in their shame is, again, invective here. Okay? Another way he responds is to stress his superiority. We've already looked at that passage. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. And again, this reminds me a little bit of trash talking. Sometimes he even mocks his opponents. So over here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, here's how he mocks them. If someone comes and preaches another Jesus than the one we preached, or if you received a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you submit to it readily enough. For I think I am not in the least inferior to these superlative apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I'm not in knowledge. In every way we've made this plain to you in all things. By calling them super apostles or superlative apostles, the Greek literally means hyper apostles, right? He's mocking them. Okay? Now, note, invective, stressing your superiority, using mocking language. Maybe we should query Paul at this point. Right? Is it, for instance, appropriate to respond to somebody with whom one has difference by using invective? Okay, we're all friends here, right? Raise your left hand if you've ever used invective. Did you at least have the grace to feel guilty about it? Okay? Now, one of the reasons I bring this up, we're querying Paul, but of course we're querying ourselves here as well. The last political season was filled with invective. Now, I've got a friend who's an historian of political thought in the United States, and he says that the kind of bipartisanship that particularly people of, Deacon Phil's my generation were used to was really an anomaly in American history, is his point. To say it's because we had an external enemy, it was first Hitler or the Emperor, depending upon whether you're in the European theater or the Far Eastern theater, the Asian theater, Pacific theater, I think they called it, during World War II. And then after World War II, of course, it was the communists, particularly Russia, China to a lesser extent. But those external threats meant that internally Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, whatever, had to work together. With the fall of the wall and his